Russia has relied extensively on its cab-guided glide bombs since its war with Ukraine began. Kremlin officials call these bombs unstoppable, and for a long time, that's exactly what they were. They were used to devastating effect, with hundreds or even thousands being dropped month after month, dealing massive damage to Ukrainian towns, cities, and frontline fortifications. But the days of cabs wiping out infrastructure and causing mass casualties may be at an end, because Ukraine has finally figured out a way to stop them, turning these expensive explosives into little more than useless scrap, and bringing Russia's threat level way down in the process. To understand why this matters, it's important to first understand what a big threat these bombs truly are. The CAB, or Adjustable Aircraft Bomb, is basically Russia's equivalent of the US Joint Direct Attack Munition, or JDAM. JDAM guidance kits effectively turn unguided or dumb bombs into smart, precision munitions, making them dramatically more accurate and effective on the battlefield. The CAB does more or less the same thing. It upgrades dumb bombs, fitting them with steering fins and satellite-powered guidance systems, allowing them to hit pre-programmed locations. Their accuracy is exceptional. In good conditions, with the right weather and clear readings, they can strike a target within a margin of error of just 20 meters, or 65 feet. That's more than good enough to hit a specific building or structure, making it easy for Russia to take out the exact targets they want with remarkable reliability. The folding wings fitted to cabs give them extended range too. Many can travel around 40 miles or 65 kilometers to reach their targets, but others can go significantly further, with the most advanced models equipped with the latest and greatest UMPK guidance modules, boasting a claimed range of around 120 miles or 195 kilometers. While that's nowhere close to the 1,000-plus mile range of many missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles, like Shahed drones, it's still an impressive amount of range for a bomb of this size. It allows Russia to fire cabs from inside its own airspace, for example, but target locations beyond the border, in Ukraine's occupied territories or other regions. Once launched, the bomb's GPS navigation system takes off, with the weapon using its fins to steer itself to its preset destination. And once they get there, they're packing more than enough explosive firepower to deal serious damage and destruction. As far as warheads go, cabs vary widely in size and destructive power. Smaller variants carry warheads of around 500 pounds, roughly 225 kilograms. Others double that, reaching 1,000 pounds or about 450 kilograms. But that's just the beginning. Russia also deploys much heavier versions. The CAB 1500, for example, carries a warhead weighing roughly 1,500 kilograms over 3,000 pounds. These are true block-busting weapons. At impact, they can create craters up to 50 feet wide, designed to destroy hardened targets, reinforce structures, and critical infrastructure. These heavy-duty warheads are used when the Kremlin's war machine wants to deal the maximum amount of damage in the minimum amount of time, destroying the likes of concrete bunkers and fortified Ukrainian defensive positions, or to wipe out civilian infrastructure off the map entirely. And it's not just that cabs have incredible range, enormous power, and exceptional precision. They're also extremely difficult to intercept or stop in any way too, since they fly at such high speeds, typically reaching several hundred miles per hour as they hone in on their chosen targets. On top of all of this, they're not all that expensive to make. A high-end cab fitted with a UMPK module, for example, will cost Russia around $25,000 per unit. These factors have made cabs an integral and almost invaluable part of Russia's arsenal, and even Ukraine was forced to admit as much. The country's newspaper, Strana, wrote on October 24, 2025, "The Russians have struck gold. Their cabs carry 2 or 3 times more explosive than Shahed drones, fly at higher speeds, maneuver less predictably thanks to the UMPK, and are smaller than a missile, making them harder to shoot down." Military Portal, The War Zone, agreed, writing around the same time, "The CAB with a long-range UMPK module is a huge headache for air defenses. They're extremely difficult to shoot down because they're small, relatively fast, flying at a speed of between 250 and 310 miles per hour, and do not leave a thermal signature." And for many months, Russia took full advantage of these weapons. Throughout 2024, it dropped anywhere from 3,200 to 3,500 of them each month. In 2025, that figure exploded, with some months seeing several thousand cabs fall. In fact, A single week in October 2025 saw Russian aircraft fire a staggering 1,370 CAB bombs. For the Ukrainian Defense Forces, this was an enormous setback. They thought they'd already found a way to counter the CAB threat. In 2024, Kyiv's forces realized that, despite their many advantages, these guided bombs had one significant drawback, an Achilles heel that could prove to be their undoing. They could be jammed. It's a similar story with a lot of guided munitions, since they typically rely on satellite navigation systems to find and strike their targets. It's possible for opposition forces to jam those satellite signals, effectively turning these smart bombs back into dumb ones, leaving them flying blind and far less likely to reach their destinations. They can still deal serious amounts of damage even when jammed, but will often veer off course and miss their intended targets. In other words, jamming these bombs' communications is one of the best ways to dramatically reduce their impact on the battlefield and decrease the amount of damage and casualties they cause. So, that's exactly what Ukraine did. Its engineers and defense industry professionals studied the CAB's design, figured out how it worked, and used their own electronic warfare equipment to disable their communications. Initially, this worked well. The CABs that Russia was using back then had a relatively rudimentary Cometa-4 Controlled Reception Pattern Antenna (CRPA) system. Also known as an adaptive antenna, null steering antenna, or a beamforming antenna, the CRPA system uses multiple antenna elements. The Cometa-4 system, for example, had 4 of these elements, and they could be used in various ways. The signals from multiple antennas could be added together, for example, to amplify their signal. Alternatively, and more importantly, individual antennas could be used to subtract or nullify signals, similar to how noise-cancelling headphones are able to selectively block out certain ambient sounds while in use. This method allowed a CAB equipped with a Cometa-4 to effectively bypass a certain number of jammers. To be more precise, with its 4 antenna elements in total, the Cometa-4 was effectively able to cancel out up to 3 jammers at a time. That wasn't too much of a problem for Ukraine, however. It merely had to use a minimum of 4 jammers at a time to effectively render these bombs worthless, diverting them away from their targets like frontline fortifications and causing them to explode in empty fields or other areas where they had little chance of dealing any real damage. For a while this worked. Reports show that many of Russia's bombs were veering wildly off target. Millions of dollars of explosives were being wasted, with bombs that were supposed to strike troop concentrations or bunkers ending up in farmers' fields or other empty, worthless patches of land. But then Russia upgraded its technology. As a Ukrainian defense industry spokesperson explained, the effectiveness of CABs depends directly on their guidance system. Previously, they used the Cometa-4 CRPA, and later after, Ukraine expanded its electronic warfare EW system Cometa-8. With twice as many elements compared to the Cometa-4, the Cometa-8 allowed CABs to cancel out up to 7 jammers at a time, with 1 antenna left over to preserve its communications and allow it to continue honing in on its exact target. Again, Ukraine worked hard to counteract these new systems, investing in more EW equipment to jam the additional antennas. But Russia kept upping the ante. It was a feverish, frantic back-and-forth situation, with each side constantly going further and further to cancel out the other side's upgrades. When Ukraine found a way to deal with the Cometa-8, for example, Russia pushed its satellite guidance systems further, increasing the number of elements to 12, then to 16. Not only that, but they also changed the ways in which these antennas worked. As the spokesperson notes, the Russians developed a fundamentally new series of CRPAs. We compare their creation to the development of the Enigma in World War II. These CRPAs are capable of resisting a level of jamming that significantly exceeds the number of their antenna elements. It reached a point where Russia's bombs were fitted with an 8-element system that needed a whopping 19 jammers to counter. Some were dramatically more resistant, impossible to counter with even 100 jammers concentrated on them. And even on the rare occasions when Ukraine's jamming technology worked, it wasn't as effective as it once had been, only kicking in at short ranges when the bombs were only a few hundred meters away from their targets. For a time, it seemed that Russia had won this fight, and it used CABs to devastating effect, wiping out not just frontline defenses, but civilian structures like schools and residential buildings too. But it wasn't going to last, because Ukraine was working on something that would shift the balance of power back in its favor, at last. Now, before we get into that, there's more where this came from. So if you're getting value from the military show, don't forget to subscribe. After years of suffering the terrible effects of Russia's smart precision bombs, Ukraine finally worked out the ultimate way to stop them. A new jammer, unlike anything seen before. One that Russia has no answer for. One that makes even their best CRPA systems absolutely useless. Enter the Lima Quant. Developed by Ukrainian defense contractor in conjunction with the country's elite Night Watch EW unit, the Lima Quant system is said to be able to nullify cabs entirely. A spokesperson for the company revealed to reporters that as soon as Ukraine started to use this system, the effectiveness of cabs dropped to zero. On a roughly 700-kilometer stretch of the front, the enemy dropped 869 cabs in one of the previous months. The consequences of these strikes were minor injuries to 8 servicemen. That last point is worth reiterating. Russia dropped almost 1,000 bombs along 700 kilometers, 435 miles of land, and only 8 Ukrainian soldiers were injured as a result. For Kyiv's forces, that's an astonishing success story, whichever way you look at it. And for Russia, it's an abject, humiliating failure, a colossal waste of money, time and resources, producing and dropping that many bombs for absolutely no tangible result or advantage. So, how does this system actually work? Well, the company and the Ukrainian military have so far been tight-lipped when it comes to revealing any technical specifications or exact details about the Lima Quant system. But we do have some idea regarding its effectiveness, with a spokesperson explaining, "The cabs either did not hit, or they could not even be released because the guidance system produced a navigation error. Russian pilots didn't understand what was happening because navigation on these CRPAs was lost 100 kilometers before the line of combat." The spokesperson also noted that a similar situation occurred when the company created its initial Lima EW system, which has proven enormously effective at countering Russia's other aerial threats, like Shahed-style drones and cruise missiles. For the price of around $1.2 million, each Lima EW unit can protect entire pieces of infrastructure or key strategic locations from aerial attacks. And in 2025, reports emerge of these systems even proving strong enough to handle Russia's fastest and deadliest missiles, Kinzhals. Able to reach peak speeds of Mach 10, which is over 7,670 miles per hour, these missiles have historically been almost impossible to intercept. Launched by modified Mikoyan MiG-31 interceptors and tipping the scales at an eye-watering 4.7 tons, they can travel as high as 15.5 miles or 25 kilometers above the ground, delivering a 1,000-pound or 450-kilogram payload over a distance of around 300 miles or 480 kilometers. Even the best Western air defenses delivered to Ukraine, like the US Patriot missile system, have struggled to deal with the Kinzhal, which is why Russia so often launches at least a couple of them when carrying out their massive aerial assaults of Ukrainian cities, power plants, substations, and other locations. Fortunately, the Lima EW entered the arena and proved more than capable of bringing down literally dozens of these missiles with ease. They also did it with style, humorously replacing the missile's satellite navigation signals with the famous Ukrainian anthem entitled "Our Father is Bandera," in reference to the Ukrainian World War II insurgent of the same name. So, as they draw closer to Ukrainian targets, Kinzhal signals are replaced with their enemy's melody, which sends them veering wildly off course, often striking several hundred yards away from their intended destinations. It may be that the Lima Quant system, the new and increasingly powerful version of this EW system, works in a similar way against the CAB glide bombs, but Lima's overall rollout hasn't exactly been the smoothest operation. Because there's one big downside to this system: it doesn't separate between friends and foes. It jams everything around it, and that can include Ukrainian drones as well as Russia's aerial threats. Thanks to this, some Ukrainian commanders have argued against the usage of the Lima system, as the company's spokesperson explains. Brigade commanders conducting combat operations began imposing bans on EW operation, arguing that their Mavic drones and bombers couldn't carry out missions. These bans are our main problem right now. The company behind Lima notes that this problem could quite easily be solved by modifying Ukrainian drones to make them resistant to the Lima EW effects. This has led to a clash between the company and certain brigade commanders, with both sides blaming the other for their respective problems. Some commanders have even filed complaints of corruption against the company, which led to delays in developing Lima Quant. Competitors, unhappy with the extremely rapid pace of Lima deployment, began making unfounded complaints to law enforcement. The work of the team and the manufacturer was suspended for more than half a year, which led to significant losses. Despite all this, it appears that the situation has, at last, settled down, and Lima Quant is already in active use and having a miraculous effect on the battlefield. Its makers claim that this system is uniquely effective, with no other EU system able to cope so well at countering the new Russian Kometa antenna systems. Today, Lima Quant is the only system in the world capable of suppressing these CRPAs at a distance of 50 kilometers, cabs at distances of more than 100 kilometers, and cruise and ballistic missiles at even greater distances. Indeed, the system isn't just good for stopping cab bombs, it's also proven increasingly effective against missiles, including the aforementioned Kinzhal. According to Ukrainian reporting, Patriot-equipped air defenses were able to intercept the first confirmed Kinzhal in May 2023. And Ukrainian officials later said that over time, more than 20 Kinzhal missiles launched at Kyiv have been successfully shot down. The 41 or 42 figure often cited in air defense reporting actually referred to a December 2023 engagement involving Shahed drones, not Kinzhals. That still means tens of millions of dollars worth of Russian missiles and drones have been wasted, on top of the countless cabs and other aerial threats that failed to find their targets. It almost sounds too good to be true. And it's important to exercise caution and moderation when talking about new weapons or innovative defenses like Lima Quant. They may seem all-powerful at first, but it may be just a matter of time until Russia figures out some new way to get around them. That caution is even more important because more recent reporting suggests Russia has been adapting some of its ballistic missile tactics, which may be reducing interception rates in certain cases. For now, however, the system appears to be working very well, and as long as the team behind Lima remains proactive in countering future Russian threats and keeping its technology up to date, this could still become an enormous boon for Ukrainian forces. It quite literally nullifies one of Russia's most important weapons, as a Night Watch officer explains. When implemented on a sufficiently large scale and coordinated across operational sectors, these systems can dramatically limit the ability of guided bombs and UAVs to strike intended targets. In other words, if Ukraine can roll out enough of these Lima Quant systems, it won't matter how many drones, missiles, or glide bombs Russia sends its way. Almost all will be eliminated, with their signals jammed and communications blocked far before the point of impact. And that's already happening. In late 2025, Ukrainian officials confirmed that they had found new ways to counter Russia's glide bombs with an advanced EW system, which has since been revealed to be the Lima Quant. The same officials added that they were in the process of extending these systems, broadening their coverage and deploying them in additional areas to provide more and more of Ukrainian territory and infrastructure with an invisible yet impenetrable electronic shield. A barrier of electronic energy that even the fastest and most advanced Russian bombs and missiles cannot bypass. We can't know how long that barrier will last. Russia may already be at work on the next evolution of its CRPA navigation systems. But at least for the time being, Ukraine has the breathing room it needs and no longer has to be quite as fearful of Russia's bombs raining down from above.
Ukraine is going in deep and hard. The final brutal message has been delivered to Putin, and it's precisely what Russia's president doesn't want to hear. Russia is going down. Everything Russian will burn in the occupied territories and beyond, as Ukraine unleashes a brutal tactic that is shattering the rear, crippling the front, and wiping out everything that Russia has. Medium-range strikes are here, and Ukraine is using them to make 2026 the year of Russia's biggest losses yet. If Putin wants a message, the Magyar birds delivered it in an April 16th X-post that made it clear that Ukraine has a new strategy that Russia can't handle. "Worms, you're declared the birds. "We're just warming up the engines. Buckle up. It's about to go all the way down your throat." This is a warning of things to come, sure, but they are also words that will send shockwaves throughout the Kremlin because they come on the back of a night of strikes against Russian equipment and infrastructure in the occupied territories that was unlike anything Russia had seen before. Overnight into April 16th, Ukraine delivered a massive blow to Putin. On the agenda, 16 military targets spanning Donetsk, Crimea, and even Russia itself that were all chosen to weaken Russia's war effort as it attempts to launch a spring offensive. We'll be digging into the specifics in a moment, but on the list were air defense systems linked to Russia's Iskander ballistic missiles, oil depots went down, Black Sea Fleet logistics were destroyed. If it was Russian and within range, Ukraine hit it overnight. And it did so using medium-range drones that are quickly becoming the game changer that Ukraine has needed to turn the tide against Russia in the war. The momentum in Ukraine is shifting, and the footage shows us why. In Donetsk and Crimea, the infamous Azov First Corps is flying FPV drones over key logistical facilities. In footage shared by Anton Gerashenko on X, we see what Ukraine's drones see. Full-color, high-definition footage that shows Ukraine's drones traveling deep into occupied Donetsk, where they are targeting Russia's logistical infrastructure. Russia's air defenses can't do a thing. Over and over, the drones strike, hitting convoys, armored vehicles, troop gatherings, and everything that is part of the logistical network that allows Russia to keep on pushing in Donetsk. Ukraine's drones can now go deep enough and fly so accurately a long way behind enemy lines that they're taking out enemy convoys on the crucial logistical lifelines that Russia needs to use to make its spring offensive possible. The Magyar Birds shared even more footage in their X post, 6 minutes of it in fact, which shows us that it's not just trucks and troops that Ukraine is hitting. The story remains the same. Deep in the occupied territories, Ukraine's drones keep on hitting their targets. Rarely do we see even a sign of Russia's air defenses protecting infrastructure that Putin needs to keep his offensive going. What we do see is those air defenses being destroyed in massive numbers, as the very weapons they are supposed to take out are being used to destroy them. Fires burn, buildings go up in smoke. If it's Russian and can be used in any way to keep Russia's war machine rolling, it's become a target of the drones that Ukraine has tweaked and mastered. What we're seeing in all of this footage is the key to Ukraine winning the war. And that brings us right back to the overnight strikes on April 16th. On the 16th day of April, Putin's true enemy gave to him 16 shattered targets in his military. First, we focus on Donetsk. The subject of a spring offensive that is supposed to cripple the fortress belt, Donetsk is the region of Ukraine that Putin covets above all others. Mineral-rich and long claimed by Putin to be the rightful property of Russia, Donetsk has been central to the maximalist demands that Putin has made if peace is to be declared in the war. Ukraine isn't willing to cede the territory. Russia is killing itself to take it. On April 8th, it was revealed that Russia is bleeding 316 soldiers for every square kilometer of Donetsk it's taking. That number is only going to climb higher as Ukraine executes a medium-range strike strategy that reached its zenith on April 16th. Among the Donetsk targets that we saw being struck in the video shared by the Magyar Birds was an OSA-AK air defense system, which Russia has stationed in the occupied settlement of Vodiana. Ukraine also took aim at Russia's Rubicon unit, created specifically to serve as Putin's most dangerous drone experts. Rubicon wants to be what Ukraine is already proving itself to be, masters of drone warfare. On April 16th, Ukraine hit an unmanned aerial vehicle facility in Hirna, which it says was being used by Rubicon as a drone depot and workshop. The first separate center of the Ukrainian unmanned systems forces was behind this attack, and what it has achieved is the crippling of Russia's own drone strategy, right as Ukraine is coming into its own with its attacks against the Russian rear. Then, a bad night for Russia escalated. As air defenses and drone units in Donetsk burned, Ukraine was also striking hard and often in Crimea. Illegally annexed by Russia since 2014, Crimea was once one of the linchpins of Putin's strategy in Ukraine. A peninsula that was supposed to be well outside of the range of any of the weapons Ukraine has in its arsenal, Crimea was supposed to be a place where Russia would be able to gather troops and equipment that it could shuttle across the Black Sea and into the Ukrainian mainland. But over 4 years of warfare, Ukraine has gotten stronger, developed new weapons, and made the Black Sea routes that were so important to Russia unusable by a fleet that has lost a third of its warships and has withdrawn from its main Crimean port. On April 16th, Ukraine showed once again that it can hurt Russia in Crimea, and its targets were all over the peninsula. More of Russia's air defenses fell by the wayside. The Magyar Birds report that Ukraine's drone operators took out a pair of deployment bases for Russia's Iskander missile systems. These missiles are often among the aerial swarms of munitions that Russia fires into Ukraine from Crimea. Ukraine is getting better at taking Iskanders down before they can cause damage. In an April 15th attack, Russia watched as Ukraine neutralized a trio of Iskander missiles in less than an hour, which highlights a level of air defense mastery that Putin never thought Ukraine could achieve. However, Ukraine knows that hitting Iskanders at their source is better than burning through expensive air defense missiles to take them out in the air. That's what we've just seen in Crimea, a revenge strike against the types of bases that Russia is using to send its ballistic missiles into Ukraine. If those bases go down, Russia has fewer options for launching Iskander missiles, and fewer options translates into aerial assaults that are easier for Ukraine to handle. There is a method behind the massacre. Ukraine's strikes are always strategic. Speaking of strategic, attacks like these are made possible because Ukraine has spent so long ruining Russia's air defense network in Crimea. April 16th was no different. Beyond the Iskander bases, Ukraine also destroyed a Pantsir S-1 air defense system in Feodosia and an ammunition depot that is used by the remains of the Black Sea Fleet in Mazyria. That's one less air defense system that Russia can use to fire back against Ukraine's Crimean strikes, along with more ammo lost by a fleet that has already been rendered tactically inoperable by Ukraine's campaign. And there's more, a lot more. Missiles, air defenses, and ammo burned on April 16th, but Ukraine also took aim at the most precious resource Russia has in Crimea. Liquid gold went up in flames as Ukraine took out oil depots across the peninsula. But before we get to that, this is a quick reminder that you're watching The Military Show. We bring you the full picture, not just the headlines. If you want to see more of this kind of insight, then make sure you subscribe to the channel. Ukraine's 9th Battalion of the 414th Brigade played a huge role in the Crimean strikes. They targeted a pair of oil depots, Hilboky Yar and Oktyabrska, as part of an ongoing Ukrainian strategy to make it impossible for Russia to move oil and fuel to its troops, or to sell it onto countries that could provide more cash for the Russian war machine. These depot strikes add to more attacks against Russian oil infrastructure in the Baltic Sea region, which has been burning for weeks now. Incidentally, Ukraine hasn't stopped hitting Russia's Baltic infrastructure. 2 days after the oil depots in Crimea were set ablaze, news broke that Ukraine had attacked the Vyazovsk port in the Leningrad region. Right now, it's looking like Russia has nowhere to turn if it wants to get its oil to where it needs to be. Speaking of follow-up attacks, Ukraine wasn't done with Russian oil depots after April 16th. On April 18th, the Kyiv Independent reported that a series of explosions had rocked the port city of Sevastopol, which is where the Black Sea Fleet was stationed before it turned tail and fled from Ukraine's constant attacks. Now the city's oil depots are in Ukraine's crosshairs, and one of those depots is what ended up burning due to Ukrainian drones scoring direct hits. This is a classic Ukrainian double tap. It hits hard, and then it follows up with another strike against the same target, all to send the message to Putin that what Russia is doing to defend its most valuable assets isn't working. Ukraine's drones can break through the defenses, and when they do, the consequences are always devastating. Oh, and as if Ukraine's wave of strikes in Crimea wasn't enough to damage the Black Sea Fleet, the last of them took out an ammunition depot used by the fleet. So it wasn't a good night for the Black Sea Fleet on April 16th. Already forced out of Sevastopol, that fleet has lost oil that is supposed to keep it running and weapons that it intended to use against Ukraine. Who needs a navy when Ukraine has drones that can ruin what was supposed to be Russia's naval advantage? Russia's military command in the occupied territories would have been exhausted by this point. Over and over, Ukraine's drones found their marks, but if Russia thought that there was finally relief following the destruction of its military assets in Crimea, then it had another thing coming. Ukraine wasn't done yet. In Zaporizhia, which is another region that Putin is trying to target in the spring offensive, a Buk-M1 air defense system located in the occupied settlement of Bahativka was taken out. We know Ukraine's pattern by now. If an air defense unit has been destroyed, that usually means that it was guarding a target that Ukraine wants to hit. Another strike in Zaporizhia is going to come. Now that the Buk-M1 has been taken out of the game, Ukraine has the safe aerial corridor that it needs to make the strike happen. Finally, it was over, at least in the occupied regions of Ukraine. There was one more target on Ukraine's list on April 16th, but this one wasn't in Donetsk or Crimea. Ukraine took aim at a military target in Russia's Krasnodar Krai region, somewhere near the settlement of Tuapse. The commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, Robert Brovdy, didn't say much about the attack at the time of reporting it. He said that details of the operation would be coming from the Ukrainian General Staff when it knew exactly how successful it had been. Those details are in, and they're not good news for Russia. The Kyiv Independent reports that Ukraine's drone strike in Tuapse has turned an oil refinery in that region into a volcano that can be seen from the Black Sea itself. The facility, which is owned by Russian oil giant Rosneft, is one of the 10 largest refineries in all of Russia. Ukraine struck fuel tanks at the refinery, and the Krasnodar Krai regional governor, Vyacheslav Kondratiev, trotted out the classic claim that it was drone debris that did all of the damage. Of course it was debris, Vyacheslav. It was just chunks of metal that caused massive fires that spread all over a refinery that outputs 12 million tons of oil products and is responsible for up to 10% of Russia's total exports of petroleum per year. If you believe Russia, the most accurate drone debris in the world has struck again. Sarcasm aside, this was clearly another direct hit for Ukraine, and it wrapped up a 24-hour hell for Russia. Worms, you're indeed. Ukraine sent the message, and it delivered destruction on a massive scale. Now Russia can only watch as more is coming, says Ukraine. What we see here is that Ukraine is built on a deep strike strategy that was already causing major issues for Russia with the new campaign. The occupied regions are no longer safe. Targets that Russia thought Ukraine wouldn't attack are being hit, and it's all due to Ukraine developing a new type of strategy in its deep strike campaign. The era of medium-range strikes is here, and Russia is hurting because of it. Another interesting little snippet of information revealed by Brovdi is that all of these strikes were made possible because Ukraine has created something new. Within Ukraine's unmanned systems forces is a deep strike center that has just been created. It's been designed to integrate long-range options against high-value targets. Euromaidan Press reports Brovdi as claiming, and we can assume that this center is the reason why several units were able to coordinate on the 16 strikes of April 16th so effectively. We don't know much more about the center than that. Brovdi isn't about to give away any secrets that might help Russia to prepare for the next series of strikes that Ukraine has coming. But what we do know is that what we saw on April 16th is a direct result of Ukraine developing a medium-range strike capacity that it hasn't had for most of its war with Russia. Ukraine has always been at the forefront of drone development since Putin launched his invasion. The short-range drones that Ukraine developed have now become a staple of the front line and have changed what we know about ground warfare forever. Ukraine followed that revolution up with the creation of deep strike drones that are now allowing it to attack Russia hundreds of miles deep into its territory. But what Ukraine lacked for so long were drones that could hit the middle. The short-range drones couldn't fly far enough, and the long-range drones were too valuable to use on targets in occupied Ukraine. There was a long-standing gap in Ukraine's drone strategy. That gap has now been filled. The Atlantic Council reports that Ukraine started a concerted effort to fill this gap in early 2025, as it started to develop a mid-range campaign that would hit targets in the 20 to 300 kilometer range. Command points, warehouses, air defense systems, missile complexes, and much more would be the targets of this new campaign. And how about that? What we saw on April 16th just so happens to have aligned with that list of targets. Ukraine has been busy building mid-range drones that are cheaper than their long-range variants and can deliver the appropriate level of destructive force to Russia's near rear. The last year or so has been the turning point. Between March 2025 and March 26, Ukraine pulled off 365 mid-range strikes, which is precisely one per day. Half of those strikes focused on Russia's air defenses in the occupied regions, the Atlantic Council says. Now we're in April 2026, and what we've just seen is an escalation of the mid-range strategy that started about a year ago. There's a reason why half of Ukraine's strikes up to this point, as well as several in its most recent attack, have targeted Russia's air defenses. This is a consistent and constant campaign waged by Ukraine to weaken the defenses that Russia has installed to protect its assets in the occupied regions. Every air defense system that goes down opens up a route to an even more valuable target: an oil depot, a drone hub, an ammunition storage unit. All of those targets are being hit because Ukraine has taken a calculated approach to its mid-range strategy. The technology has spent years in development, and it's now starting to shine. For Russia, this is terrible news. It means that the kill zones that have already been churning through Russia's troops in ridiculous numbers have been expanded. Early in 2025, Russia's troops still had plenty to worry about. Ukraine's drone-infested kill zones stretched up to 50 kilometers beyond the front, meaning any infantry had to navigate an absolute hellscape filled with the mangled bodies of their own soldiers just to get close enough to launch an assault against Ukraine's defenses. But now, with the advent of Ukraine's medium-range drones, the kill zones have tripled in size. Troops in the near rear are now targets. They're being taken out before they can even get into the original kill zones, in what has grown into a multi-layered drone defense strategy for which Russia has no answer. It's a campaign that has no end in sight, and it's starting to cause problems for Putin. According to the Institute for the Study of Wars, or ISW's April 17th battlefield report, there is mounting societal discontent within Russia about the scale of the sacrifices being made by the country's people to fight Putin's war. The ISW reports on the results of a poll by the Russian state-owned polling agency All Russian Public Opinion Research Center. That poll has recorded 6 straight weeks of declining approval ratings for Putin. The ratings have dropped from 72.9% to 66.7% between the week of March 2nd to 8th and the week of April 6th to 12th. After what Ukraine pulled off on April 16th, we'd imagine that there is a good chance those approval ratings will drop even further, especially in Tuapse, where a refinery burns. And that's the point for Ukraine. Its medium-range campaign is all about weakening Russia. Taking out assets deep behind the front lines means Russia's assaults on the front are weaker, and weaker results inevitably add up to more casualties, which forces the Kremlin to feed yet more of Russia's people into the meat grinder. After 4 years of fighting, Russia's people are starting to have enough. That's the genius of Ukraine's strategy. If Putin is so blinded by his ambition to take Ukraine that he refuses to stop a war that has already cost his country so much, it may end up being the Russian people who force a stop to all of this. Russian state-owned polling companies are showing that the Russian people are getting angry. And remember, these will be polls that have been massaged to show the best that they possibly can to the Kremlin. As Ukraine ruins more of Russia's military, the discontent will grow, and Putin may find himself dealing with another fight. this one from inside Russia itself. That may be a fight that Putin can't win. As for the front, we're seeing a fight that Putin is failing to win right now. On the back of its mid-range campaign and other strategic initiatives,
There's an old saying in warfare: know your enemy, understand how they think, how they fight, and what they use to do it. And Ukraine took that advice to heart. It took one of Russia's weapons, rebuilt it from scratch, made it better, and started using it to blow up Russian soldiers. This is the story of Molniya and its Ukrainian twin, the Bliskavka. The Molniya, which means thunderbolt in Russian, is a fixed-wing kamikaze drone that Russia first began deploying in significant numbers in spring 2024. It wasn't an impressive-looking machine, nor a sophisticated piece of military engineering. It was built from what's essentially scrap and assembled at small facilities that look more like furniture shops than defense factories. The Russians didn't reinvent the wheel here. They packed it with electronics that just needed to do the bare minimum for navigation and flight controls. It was the cheapest possible way to put explosives in the air and fly them toward Ukrainians. And the drone worked, perhaps even too well. Before the Molniya, the general framework of drone warfare in Ukraine was relatively well defined. You had small FPV quadcopters, which were racing drone frames stuffed with explosives, costing $475 to $600 each, and deadly over short ranges. Then you had heavier bomber drones like the Nemesis and Vampire, flying 15 miles out and carrying serious payloads. But these purpose-built quadcopters were expensive enough that they were still reserved for high-value targets. For less vital targets, they constructed long-range strike drones for deep strategic hits over 100 miles into enemy territory. Each category had its purpose, its range band, and its cost bracket. But what neither side had fielded at scale was a cheap fixed-wing kamikaze drone for the middle distance. Something that could reliably reach 20 to 30 miles behind the front and carry enough explosive to destroy a vehicle, collapse a building, or kill a logistics convoy. But that changed with the Molniya. It filled the gap in middle-range operations, something of a dead zone not only for cheap drones but for strikes in general. Artillery couldn't always reach it precisely, not if it didn't want to use the best equipment in class, which could leave it open to counterattacks from enemy artillery. But the FPVs couldn't fly that far. To fill that void, Ukraine really only had short-range tactical ballistic missiles such as the ATTRIBUTIONs or domestic FP2 attack drones, both of which were quite expensive to operate in numbers needed to match Russia's attacks. But the Molniya plugged that gap for between $300 and $800 per unit. In its most common Molniya 2 configuration, it carries a combat payload of 7 to 12 pounds, flies at speeds of up to 60 miles per hour, and can reach targets up to around 30 miles from its launch point. The airframe is made from plywood, plastic, and aluminum tubes. The electronics are commercial, off-the-shelf components, primarily sourced from China. One military analyst specializing in drone warfare compared it to the AK-47 of drones. It's not technically impressive, but it's still simple, reliable enough, and can be produced in enormous numbers without a sophisticated industrial base. The Molniya 2 introduced something else that hadn't been widely seen before in this class of weapon: dual-wing mounted propellers instead of a single-nose mounted one. This made it more stable when carrying a payload, improving its handling in wind and reduced the risk of catastrophic failure mid-flight. It also made it more versatile in terms of what it could carry. Confirmed Molniya payloads have included standard fragmentation warheads, thermobaric warheads from the RPO-A Schmel infantry rocket system, and the TM-62 anti-tank mine, the last of which carries the explosive equivalent of roughly 15 pounds of TNT, enough to collapse a building. The Molniya could deliver one of these to a logistics hub 25 miles from the front without a Russian soldier getting anywhere near it. That combination of middle-distance reach, meaningful payload, and sub-$1,000 costs was, for a month or so, considered to be the holy grail of drone warfare, and made Ukrainian analysts wary of proclaiming they had the situation under control. As we covered earlier, what had been a relatively safe distance from the front line simply stopped being safe. And that wasn't all. Since the drone's design was made to be as cheap or as efficient as possible, you had extremely large leeway in terms of modifying it to fit certain use cases. This meant Russia wasn't fielding a single model of the Molniya, but an array of slightly different models that started with the basic build and branched from there. For example, some models had fiber optic controllers on the back, which curbed their range but made them undetectable to traditional electronic jamming mechanisms. Other models were outfitted with thermal cameras that acted sort of like a night vision and allowed better target acquisition while adding a bit of cost on advanced electronics. Still, other models eschewed the concept of kamikaze drones entirely. Rather than being equipped with a single charge of explosive to be detonated inside a target, the Molniya instead contained high-definition cameras and gyroscopic stabilizers, which allowed it to take high-quality images of the front line and transmit them back to the operator. Furthermore, the fact that the drone is essentially concocted from scraps of disparate technologies means that the manufacturing process is spread out. So long as a factory can assemble the parts, it can create new drones from imported bits and pieces. That means a single strike on a manufacturing plant only delays production until another one can get the rest of the parts. But Ukraine managed to not only copy the concept, but also improve upon it. The original Molniya had real structural problems, such as components bonded with hot glue that liquefied in summer heat. The drone's launch process still required precise multi-person coordination, where a single mistake meant the drone either failed to take off or crashed immediately. While this might sound minor, in combat conditions where a launch window might be 5 minutes wide, a drone that requires a perfectly synchronized 4-person effort to get airborne is a liability. The Blizgavka, which means lightning, addressed both issues. Structurally compromised components were replaced with 3D printed parts that could tolerate wider temperature ranges and repeated use. The launch was automated. Once the correct flight parameters are entered, the drone initiates takeoff independently, removing the human coordination failure point entirely. Ukrainian engineers also standardized the connectors throughout the airframe, meaning field maintenance and component replacement can be done faster and with less chance of error. The communication systems were upgraded, the assembly process was tightened to ensure higher consistency across units. The result was a drone that cost approximately $810 per unit and outperforms the original in reliability, range, and ease of deployment. The Blizgavka reaches speeds up to 68 miles per hour, can fly for 80 minutes, reaches altitudes of 2,000 meters, and with a signal relay drone extending its communications range, can strike targets up to 50 miles from its launch point, roughly double the effective range of the original Molniya. That relay drone as a reed transmitter concept is itself a clever solution. A small FPV positioned closer to the operational area retransmits the control signal, effectively doubling the Blizgavka's reach without requiring satellite connectivity for every mission, which would ultimately be a bit too expensive for one of the cheapest designs on the market. The Blizgavka is designed as a one-way strike platform, carrying a unified internal warhead of around 8 to 9 kilograms to deliver a direct hit on its target. By contrast, modularity in payload configuration is seen in systems like the Jetmax, which can carry 2 heavy charges or up to 8 smaller munitions for strikes against infantry, light vehicles, and unprotected infrastructure. This flexibility means a single platform type can cover a wide range of target categories, without requiring separate specialized variants for each mission profile. As of the Defense Tech Valley Summit in autumn 2025, the Blizgavka was already being supplied to the front line. Viri Drone, the company behind it, simultaneously unveiled additional platforms at the same event, including the Sokil reconnaissance UAV, intended for serial production, and the Jankoi unmanned ground vehicle, which is equipped with Starlink and capable of carrying over 1,000 pounds of payload. It means Ukraine isn't developing the Blizgavka in isolation. It's part of a widening portfolio of systems built around the same philosophy: identify the gap, fill it cheaply, field it fast. On the downside, the Blizgavka shares the fundamental limitations of its fixed-wing class. It's less maneuverable than an FPV quadcopter. It can't hover, it can't abort and reposition mid-approach in the same reactive way a multi-rotor can. High winds have a detrimental effect, and fog can ground it entirely. One operator, when interviewed, said he explicitly waits out a thick fog bank before proceeding with a mission. Against a moving vehicle or a target that shifts position between launch and arrival, a fixed-wing drone doesn't have the same maneuverability compared to an FPV, which can chase and adjust course at a moment's notice since it can move in any direction without facing it. But here's where money comes in. The Nemesis heavy drone, which can hover, reposition, abort mid-strike, and return to base for rearming, costs on the order of tens of thousands of dollars per aircraft and requires a ground crew, a secure launch site, Starlink hardware, and 2 trained operators per shift. The Bliskavka cost a fraction of that, and a crew of 4 can prep it in 10 minutes and launch it from a field with a pneumatic catapult. The Bliskavka isn't trying to do what the Nemesis does, it's trying to do what artillery does, meaning reach out to medium distances and hit things, but cheaper than a shell and more precise than a salvo. In that role, the fixed-wing limitations are acceptable trade-offs. Now, if you want to learn more about Ukraine's drone developments, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We post daily videos showcasing the most recent events in both Ukraine and global geopolitics. Now, while Ukraine managed to emulate the success of the Molnya in terms of offensive power, these drones ultimately have no real way of targeting one another. Their primary purpose is to serve as surface-to-surface bombardment, not mid-air dogfights on a smaller scale. Ukraine still had to somehow protect itself against the Russian drones. The answer here is a layered system, and that layering itself is significant. It turns out you need a combination of measures to counter the Molnya, including route reconnaissance, fire teams, electronic warfare, engineering protection in key areas, and stricter safety procedures during movement. What that looks like in practice is an astounding accomplishment of military tactics, technological advancement, and engineering born out of necessity. Electronic warfare jamming systems are the first line, aiming to disrupt radio-controlled Molnyas before they reach their targets. The second kinetic layer is small anti-drone fire teams, equipped with guns and modified air defense equipment. The third are physical barriers. For example, on the Izium-Sloviansk road, a 25-mile net tunnel has been built to protect logistical routes against Russian drones. The net has been designed and hung specifically to intercept low-flying fixed-wing drones on key supply routes. Anti-drone nets on vehicles, around command posts, and above troop movement corridors have become standard. Lastly, Ukraine has also made dedicated interceptor drones, which are small quadcopters that either deploy small explosives or have modified shrapnel weapons or blunt force equipment to knock enemy drones out of the sky. To illustrate the point, Ukraine produced 100,000 interceptor drones in 2025 alone, with a combat mission success rate exceeding 60%, at a cost on average 25 times less than using a Western air defense missile to achieve the same intercept. What we're looking at is the ever-evolving anti-drone ecosystem. Ukraine has built something that militaries multiple times its size haven't managed. A comprehensive, layered counter-drone architecture that operates across multiple domains simultaneously, is constantly being updated based on field feedback, and is cheap enough to sustain its scale. The Molnya and other Russian drone advancements essentially force Ukraine to build this, and in doing so, Russia may have handed Ukraine a defensive framework that will outlast this war. Meanwhile, Ukraine is simultaneously pushing its own offensive drone capabilities well beyond anything Russia has fielded in comparable price brackets. The Nemesis Regiment's Starlink-equipped heavy bombers operate from hundreds of kilometers away. Ukraine's mid-range strike drones can carry warheads that weigh over 200 pounds and have been used to strike Russian radar stations, air defense systems, and aircraft. These aren't battlefield close support weapons. They're precision deep strike assets operated by crews who are nowhere near the target. The strategic implication of using drones this way is something that hasn't really been seen in modern warfare. Russia's core advantage so far has been its willingness to spend human lives, using meat-wave assaults and mass infantry operations while accepting catastrophic casualties to inch forward. A drone war, where the person pulling the trigger is tens or even hundreds of miles away from the front, removes that tool from Russia's hands almost completely. You can't threaten an operator who's sitting in an office. You can't bleed a unit dry through artillery when the operators are behind a Starlink link and a screen. Ukraine is systematically building a military where the most dangerous work is increasingly done by machines, operated by humans who are out of reach. And Ukrainian army officials claim to have made military history in late 2025 by deploying a single land drone armed with a mounted machine gun to hold a frontline position for almost 6 weeks. As Mykola Zinkovich of Ukraine's 3rd Army Corps put it, only the UGV system, short for Unmanned Ground Vehicle, was present at the position. This was the core concept. He then summed up the strategy in 4 words. Robots do not bleed. So, how did Ukraine get here? Well, the Blizgavka is not the first time Ukraine has watched Russia introduce a new drone capability, studied it, reverse engineered it, and fielded a Ukrainian version within months. The same thing happened with fiber optic FPV drones. They were first fielded by Russia in the spring of 2024. More specifically, on March 7, 2024, Ukrainian outlets shared images of a captured Russian fiber optic FPV, which uses a thin spool of fiber optic cable instead of radio signals, making it completely immune to electronic jamming. By March 18, Dronaria, a Ukrainian drone development group, had showcased its own fiber optic drone prototype. It only took 11 days to go from captured enemy hardware to working Ukrainian prototypes. In the cat-and-mouse technological game of the full-scale war, it's often Ukraine that's held the reputation of being better innovators, with more motivated engineers and volunteers allowed to work in a more flexible environment. Often, if a new Ukrainian product or solution proves effective on the battlefield, like the early use of the basic FPV drone, Russia tends to copy it and ramp up production or purchasing. With fiber optics, Russia was first. Ukraine responded within 2 weeks with a prototype and was fielding operational versions within months. By late 2024, as Chinese factories ramped up production fueled by large Russian orders, fiber optic spool costs fell dramatically, from up to $2,500 per spool in 2023 to around $500 for a 10-kilometer spool by 2025, with complete fiber drones costing around $1,000 to $1,500. Both sides could reap the lower costs because Russia purchased fiber optics directly, while Ukraine leveraged the fact that Western countries already had it in supply or could purchase it from China. This ultimately contributed to Russia's effective use of fiber optic drones, which are immune to electronic warfare jamming due to their wide connection, allowing them to reliably strike targets and disrupt Ukrainian operations. The same cycle repeated with the Molnia. Russia fields it, Ukraine captures examples, Ukrainian engineers disassemble them, identify the flaws, and build a better version. The Blizgavka is in frontline service. This cycle keeps working for Ukraine for a specific structural reason. Russia's military development, even its volunteer and grassroots innovation efforts, operates inside a centralized command structure that requires approval chains, procurement processes, and institutional sign-off. Ukraine's system operates primarily through a combination of decentralized volunteer engineering networks and a centralized intelligence system that feeds information from the front line and dispenses it to manufacturers and designers. At that scale, Ukraine's military systems development can move from prototype to codification to frontline deployment in a fraction of the time. When a Ukrainian frontline platoon engineer builds a dual fiber optic and radio hybrid drone that costs a sliver more than a standard model and solves a persistent failure problem, a manufacturer can quickly formalize the design and produce a test batch. The testing system then distributes prototypes across the front line, tracking its progress in terms of real-life performance before deciding on formal development or subsequent changes. That pattern of development is leaps ahead of traditional Russian and even Western procurement and testing metrics. And it's because Ukraine simply doesn't have time to wait. Ukraine doesn't have Russia's population. It doesn't have Russia's industrial scale. It doesn't have Russia's artillery shell production rate or its tank reserves. But it has an engineering culture that responds to battlefield problems in days rather than months, a procurement system flexible enough to codify a platoon engineer's field modification within weeks, and an approach to drone warfare that's been refined across 4 years of the most intensive unmanned systems combat in military history. Most importantly, however, Ukraine knows full well that it's on a time crunch. If Russia decides to push the nuclear button, Ukraine doesn't have a response against it, and there's only so much you can achieve by pushing drones to the front line when you have roughly half of the active military size. But so long as that cycle of Ukraine's counter-development holds, Ukraine doesn't just keep pace with Russian drone innovation, it maintains an edge, because improving on a proven design is always faster than inventing one from scratch. And right now, Ukraine has gotten very good at picking up what Russia drops and handing it back harder. The force is growing stronger with Ukraine. After years of withstanding Russia's relentless drone swarms, the Ukrainian army may at last have the secret weapon it needs to stop them for good. It's now deployed the Jedi Drone Interceptor, a specialized hunter drone designed to seek out and eliminate Russia's aerial threats with explosive efficiency. Ukraine has created all sorts of exciting military innovations over the years, but the Jedi belongs in a class of its own, boasting the ability to change the face of this war forever. To understand why, we first need to look at what the Jedi actually is. Fortunately, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense has shared detailed technical specifications for this powerful new drone, revealing its weight, payload, speed, and range. Thanks to that, we know that the Jedi, or to give it its full title, the Jedi Shaheed Hunter, is a vertical takeoff copter-type interceptor drone. It's made up of a light yet resilient frame, fitted with 4 high-performance electric motors and powered by a high-capacity battery. Tipping the scales at just over 4 kilograms, nearly 9 pounds, the Jedi is compact and lightweight, but with the power to eliminate enemy drones with astonishing ease. It can carry payloads of up to 500 grams, just over 1 pound, and soar to altitudes of up to nearly 20,000 feet or 6 kilometers. In addition, thanks to its high-capacity battery, the Jedi can fly for extended periods of time without running out of power, enabling it to defend airspace within a radius of up to 40 kilometers or 25 miles. But arguably, its most important tech spec is its speed. According to the Ukrainian MOD, the Jedi can reach peak speeds of up to 350 kilometers per hour, approximately 220 miles per hour. That matters because this drone's job is to hunt down and intercept other drones, and it needs to be fast enough to catch up with them in order to do that. Thankfully, many of Russia's most commonly used drones move far slower than the Jedi. The Kremlin's Shaheed-class drones, for example, typically fly at speeds of around 185 kilometers per hour or 115 miles per hour, which is half as fast as the Jedi, making it relatively easy for Ukraine's impressive new interceptors to hunt them down and wipe them out. In short, Ukraine has managed to make an interceptor drone that combines the dash speed of a fighter with the flexibility of a multi-rotor UAV. It can launch from almost anywhere without the need for catapults or runways, and it has the ability to eliminate all major drones in the Russian arsenal. And the Jedi gets even more impressive when you take a closer look at how it actually works. Control teams manage their flight coordination, communications, and targeting from ground-based stations, while nearby radar systems transmit real-time data to the drone while it's in the air. This allows it to automatically lock on and hone in on its targets with speed and efficiency. And the fact that this is a radar-cued system means that it gives Ukraine drone crews another option to work with when dealing with sudden or unexpected aerial assaults. The Jedi Interceptor is also equipped with both daylight and thermal imaging cameras. That's incredibly important because many of Russia's drone attacks occur overnight under the cover of darkness. If the Jedi only had daylight cameras, it could struggle to detect, engage, and eliminate enemy UAVs during the night. But thanks to its thermal imaging cameras, it has no trouble at all hunting down Russia's Shaheeds and other drones at any time of day or night, and even during other periods of poor visibility like poor weather conditions. One thing Ukraine's MOD hasn't revealed is the exact warhead or fuse that is fitted to the Jedi. However, since we know that it's capable of carrying a 500-gram payload, that strongly suggests that this drone is not designed to merely collide or ram into enemy UAVs in order to bring them down, but to actually blow them up before they have a chance to get anywhere close to their intended targets. That's vital too, because some of Russia's drones, despite being quite simplistic and cheap to make, are relatively resilient. A Shaheed-style drone, for example, could potentially withstand a mid-air collision without suffering fatal damage, allowing it to continue on its flight path and deal damage to its target. It would usually require perfectly timed nose-on collision to bring one of these UAVs down through sheer force of impact alone. However, given that the Jedi comes equipped with its own explosives, which may include a small blast fragmentation or close burst effects, it should have no trouble dealing the requisite damage to Shaheed's propellers, control surfaces, engines, or guidance sections to consistently take them out. Of course, it's one thing to talk about a drone's technical specifications or prospective capabilities, but there have been plenty of military innovations over the years that sound great on paper but fail to deliver when it comes to real-world combat scenarios. Fortunately, the Jedi isn't one of them. This is not just a theoretically powerful addition to Ukraine's arsenal, it's a proven one. The MOD confirmed in March 2026 that the Jedi was already being used to engage and eliminate numerous types of Russian drones. They include the aforementioned Shaheeds, which have been the backbone of the Kremlin's drone army for several years, as well as other strike drones like Gerans and Gerberas. The Jedi has also proven its worth against Zala and SuperCam reconnaissance platforms, so it's not just capable of nullifying Russia's aerial attacks, but also wiping out its eyes in the skies and starving the enemy of all-important intelligence too. In strategic terms, this is invaluable for Ukraine. It represents a clear shift in the country's drone warfare tactics, a clear transition or even an evolution from improvised counter-UAV tactics to a much more defined, integrated, and scalable short-range air defense layer that can support not just frontline units, but also protect critical real-area infrastructure too. The Jedi will add another layer to Ukraine's already vast and complex air defense network. With radar stations feeding these drones a constant and steady stream of real-time information, they'll be able to follow clear, predictable, and accurate paths to intercept incoming targets. Plus, since they're capable of quick vertical takeoffs from almost anywhere, mobile units will be able to transport these drones around and deploy them in key locations, close to towns, cities, logistic hubs, or critical infrastructure, such as substations, energy facilities, and bridges. Once in the air, trained drone operators and ground crews will take over control of the Jedi drones, ensuring that as many of them as possible find and destroy their targets, saving lives and protecting infrastructure in the process. It's important to note that Ukraine is already extremely effective at bringing down Russian drones. According to a report from the Center for European Policy Analysis (CEPA), published in 2026, Ukraine managed to either suppress or destroy just over 80% of Russian aerial targets in December 2025, and that figure rose to over 85% by February 2026 and rose again to almost 90% in March. Even though Russia launched around 28% more drones at Ukraine in March compared to February, Kyiv's defenders were still able to take out the vast majority of them. It's been routinely taking out at least 80% of Russia's drones for quite some time, relying on the likes of relatively rudimentary interceptor drones, air defense systems, interceptor missiles, and mobile units to do so. With the addition of the Jedi to its arsenal, Ukraine could start to consistently take down at least 90% of Russia's UAVs every month, or even move towards the 95% mark. This is one of the core objectives of the country's defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, who stated in February 2026, "The goal is to identify 100% of aerial threats in real time and intercept at least 95% of missiles and drones." With fewer and fewer of Russia's drones and other aerial threats, like cruise and ballistic missiles, actually striking their targets, the Kremlin's aerial assaults will become far more wasteful and less impactful. Ukraine will slowly but surely be able to close off its skies and shield its people and its infrastructure against these attacks, forcing its enemy to either rewrite its strategy or simply retreat, accepting at long last that this is a war that it cannot hope to win. There are several clear reasons why the Jedi could prove to be the most important piece of the puzzle in achieving these goals. But before we get into that, if this is the kind of insight you want more of, make sure you're subscribed to The Military Show. We break it down like this every week. Now, Ukraine has been working towards this point for quite some time, with a long-running plan to design, develop, and integrate interceptor drones into its air defense network. Why? Because it understands how valuable these assets are. In a war that's become so heavily dominated by drones and aerial attacks, rather than conventional frontline assaults with tanks and armored vehicles, both sides have been battling it out to gain the upper hand in the skies. Russia has relied on a brute force approach, using its economic might to ramp up production of low-cost drones and launch bigger and bigger swarms at Ukraine as the months and years have passed. Ukraine, meanwhile, has had to think outside the box to counteract that growing threat. Originally, the main way to deal with drones was to launch interceptor missiles at them, but there's a clear problem with that approach. It's not cost-effective at all. If you're launching a potentially million-dollar missile just to eliminate a drone that costs less than $50,000 to make, you're clearly on the losing side of that equation. And given that Ukraine doesn't have the same economic muscle as Russia and has to rely on the support of its allies across the West to supply it with air defense systems and missiles, its commanders quickly realized they wouldn't be able to rely on conventional air defenses in the long term. They had to find a cheaper and smarter way to deal with the Kremlin swarms. And what better way to take out a drone than with another drone? It's a much more balanced method, with both drones effectively cancelling each other out, and it's much more affordable too. While the Ukrainian MOD hasn't revealed exactly how much a Jedi costs, the average price per unit will only be a fraction of the cost of a typical interceptor missile. That low price point allows Kyiv to produce its interceptor drones in the enormous quantities necessary to nullify Russia's vast swarms. Indeed, in January 2026, the MOD confirmed that military units were already receiving over 1,500 anti-Shahed interceptor drones on a daily basis. This has significantly strengthened units' capabilities to counter aerial threats at multiple levels, from the front line to the protection of rear areas. With production rates that high, it doesn't really matter how many drones Russia fires at Ukraine, as it should have more than enough interceptors, including Jedis but also other models, to cancel out every single one of them. This approach has the added benefit of preserving Ukraine's limited missile stocks, because as mentioned, missiles are far more costly to produce, and while Ukraine makes many missiles of its own nowadays, like the Long Neptune and Flamingo, it largely relies on Western allies to provide the interceptors used by its most powerful air defense systems. The Patriot system, for example, is the only system that has proven good enough to work against some of Russia's fastest ballistic missiles, like Iskander-Ms and Kinzhals. It only works with American PAC-2 GEM-T missiles. A single PAC-3 is worth around $3 million, and the US only makes around 500 to 600 each year. And Ukraine is just one of the many countries on the waiting list to buy them. Because of this, Kyiv has only received a little over 600 PAC-3 missiles over the course of the entire conflict so far, which is still a healthy amount for counteracting Russia's missile threat, but also means that these systems cannot simply be relied upon day in and day out to eliminate the enemy's aerial assets. Nor can Patriots and other systems like them be wasted taking out cheap drones. Instead, they have to be used conservatively and cautiously in order to extract maximum value from every single interceptor. That's where the Jedis come in. While Ukraine keeps its Patriots and other big interceptor missile platforms in reserve to negate bigger and deadlier threats, it can deploy literally hundreds of interceptor drones every day, without having to worry about wasting enormous amounts of cash or depleting its limited stocks of key munitions. With the war into its 5th year, this type of resource management is more important than ever. There's huge pressure on the economies and military production capacities of both sides, and neither can afford to simply throw millions of dollars worth of munitions away without getting some serious return on those investments. Every resource matters at this stage. And while Russia stubbornly continues with its wasteful tactics, Ukraine is playing a much smarter game, turning the economics of air defense in its favor by fielding cheaper, simpler assets valued in the thousands of dollars rather than the millions. And Ukraine isn't having to sacrifice anything or put its people and infrastructure at any sort of added risk by doing this. In fact, its Jedi drones perfectly align with the country's war plan and the current tactical reality of the conflict in 2026. Right now, Russia is leaning on its swarm tactics as a critical component of its broader military plan. It regularly sends hundreds of strike drones over Ukraine's borders in the span of a single night, using low-altitude routing to evade radar detection and the cover of darkness to further complicate Ukraine's detection and interception operations. The Kremlin's commanders hope that this tactic will prove too much for Ukraine, forcing their opponents into wasting time, money and resources on their defensive efforts, while still suffering losses as at least some of the drones and follow-up missile strikes find their targets. Interceptor drones are the ultimate antidote to this approach. They push Ukraine's point of defense forward into the air itself with the ability to find, chase, overtake, and destroy the threat before it even enters its terminal phase. And the data shows that this strategy isn't just working, it's exceeding expectations. Ukrainian officials have confirmed, for example, that interceptor drones accounted for over 70% of Shahed kills around Kyiv in February 2026. In April, Defense Minister Fedorov shared an even more encouraging statistic on his official Telegram account. A record 33,000 plus enemy UAVs of various types were destroyed by interceptor drones in March, twice as many as the previous month. Now, the Institute for Science and International Security also published a report in April 2026, which highlighted the growing role and immense value of interceptor drones in Ukraine's defensive campaign, noting that even as Russia attempted to up the ante of its assaults, fewer of its Shaheds were actually finding their targets. Despite record launch volumes, hit rates declined, indicating improved interception capabilities, including the growing role of interceptor drones, mobile fire groups, and layered defense systems. With this kind of data, it's not hard to see why Ukraine has been so eager to invest in interceptor drone production, and how these small but impactful additions to the country's air defenses could completely change the war moving forward. Another huge advantage of Jedis and drones like them is their flexibility. As mentioned earlier, they're not just capable of taking out Russia's strike drones like Shaheeds and Gerans, but also its reconnaissance or scout drones like the Zala and Supercam models. The importance of these aerial intelligence gathering platforms cannot be understated. While they may not have any direct offensive capacities, these drones gather the data that the Kremlin's artillery units and ground teams need to conduct their assaults effectively. They keep Russia informed about Ukrainian troop concentrations, asset positions and movements, both on the ground and in the air. If Ukraine can take them out, they'll eliminate those lines of data, slashing the amount of information that their enemy can gather and use to inform their attacks. That, in turn, should make things much harder for Russian units, which will increasingly be forced to plan actions blind, which will lead to greater risks and a higher chance of failure, loss, and wasted resources. Ukraine, meanwhile, will find it easier to defend its most important locations, like tactical headquarters, command posts, ammunition stockpiles, and supply lines. It'll also be able to reposition assets and maneuver units without the fear that Russia is watching its every move from above and preempting its next steps. In short, the addition of Jedi interceptors is nothing short of a game-changer for Ukraine. These affordable, scalable drones are simple to use, cheap enough to produce en masse, and tough enough to take out almost any enemy UAV they encounter. Their presence presents Russia with a problem it cannot solve: a direct and powerful counter to its enormous drone onslaught, and yet another example of how Ukraine's innovative domestic defense industry continues to evolve and adapt to this war, evening the odds with its enemy and becoming the envy of much of the wider world in the process. And this is just one way in which Ukraine is leveling up its drone warfare tactics. Russia began its war with Ukraine with a massive missile arsenal, ready to rain down fire on its opponent and wipe out entire pieces of infrastructure in an instant. And the Kremlin has relied heavily on those assets over the course of the conflict so far, regularly launching the likes of Iskander and Kinzhal ballistic missiles towards Ukrainian towns, cities, and frontline positions. A genius Ukrainian strategy has been put into action, crippling the Kremlin's missile supplies and leaving Russia with fewer ways to even launch them in the first place. It all started when Kyiv's commanders realized that they had two options to deal with the Russian missile threat. They could either rely on their air defense systems, both domestic and imported from allied nations, to take out Russian missiles en route to their targets, or they could eliminate Russia's missiles at the source instead, taking out stockpiles and delivery systems. The former option would arguably be the easier of the two. In theory, all Ukraine would have to do is set up its air defenses and let them get to work, with radars detecting incoming missiles and launch platforms firing interceptors to take them out in mid-air, nullifying the threat in no time. But there's one big problem with that plan. Russian ballistic missiles are some of the fastest on Earth. The Iskander M, for example, is a short-range ballistic missile, SRBM, capable of flying at speeds of up to Mach 7, which works out at over 5,300 miles per hour. Relying on a mixture of inertial navigation systems, INS, global navigation satellite systems, GLONASS, and terrain contour matching technology, these missiles soar through the skies and strike their targets with remarkable levels of accuracy. And there have been countless confirmed cases of Iskander attacks on Ukrainian territory, right from the very beginning of the war, when Russia launched multiple Iskander missiles over the border and into Ukraine as part of its initial assault. Since those early stages, Iskanders have been used to wipe out Ukrainian air defense systems, helicopters, and fighter jets, while also dealing serious damage to both military and civilian infrastructure. Indeed, while Russia's official statements and statistics should always be taken with a large pinch of salt, the country's Ministry of Defense claimed in early 2025 to have destroyed over 1,400 high-value targets with Iskander-Ms alone. The Kinzhal is even faster. An air-launched ballistic missile with a range of up to 1,242 miles or 2,000 kilometers, the Kinzhal can reportedly reach peak speeds of Mach 10, over 7,600 miles per hour, placing it in the top 10 fastest ballistic missiles currently in operation. Like the Iskander, the Kinzhal has been used to devastating effect in Ukraine. There have been reports of these missiles taking out a diverse range of targets, including weapons depots, fuel storage facilities, drone plants, and critical infrastructure. Because these missiles are so fast and advanced, most of Ukraine's air defenses simply aren't capable of reliably and consistently intercepting them. It has to instead rely on the US Patriot system to have any chance of stopping the likes of Kinzhals and Iskanders before they strike their targets. Unfortunately, Ukraine doesn't have enough of these systems for nationwide coverage. An even bigger problem is the lack of PAC-3 missiles, which the Patriot uses. These missiles aren't just in short supply in Ukraine, but all over the world, with only around 600 to 700 being produced each year. And Ukraine isn't the only country that wants them. Numerous other nations have placed their own orders for PAC-3 missiles, and each one is worth in excess of $3 million, making it particularly difficult for Kyiv to acquire the ample amounts of interceptors it needs to withstand Russia's intense aerial assaults. A report from March 2026 revealed that Ukraine has only received around 600 of these missiles over the course of the entire war. This was confirmed by Dmytro Litvin, one of the close advisors to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. That's simply not enough. In an ideal world, Ukraine would need several hundred PAC-3s every single year to be able to bring down most, if not all, of Russia's ballistic missiles. But this is not an ideal world, and with limited stocks, Ukraine has to use its Patriot systems sparingly. It must rely on other aerial defenses to deal with aerial threats that are easier to intercept, such as drones and cruise missiles, and only fire PAC-3s in specific instances when there is a high chance of actually stopping a ballistic Iskander or Kinzhal. Even then, without enough PAC-3s arriving each year, Ukraine simply cannot hope to counteract all of Russia's attacks. So, its commanders had to enact a different strategy. A smarter, more efficient, and more devastating strategy focused on weakening Russia's entire missile launch capabilities. The logic was sound. If Russia had smaller stockpiles and fewer launch platforms, it wouldn't be able to fire quite as many ballistic missiles towards Ukrainian towns and cities. Fewer missiles in the air means Russia's overall aerial threat level decreases, with less risk of damage and casualties for Ukraine to endure. However, while this plan sounds simple on paper, it was immensely complicated to put into action. It involved Ukraine having to find out where Russia's missiles were being stockpiled, where their launchers were positioned, and where their key components like chipsets and guidance systems were being assembled. Once it had that data, it then had to plan and execute precision strikes on those locations, using its own drones and missiles to deal as much damage as possible to the enemy's assets and infrastructure. Fortunately, Ukraine has now amassed years of experience when it comes to mastering the art of drone warfare and orchestrating impactful deep strikes on Russian soil. It has a proven track record in this field, with every passing year seeing more and more successful attacks on enemy bases, refineries, logistic hubs, airfields, and other critical locations. And in 2025, the Ukrainian armed forces made it one of their top priorities to seek and destroy Russia's most important missile sites by any means necessary. To limit the effectiveness of the Iskander-M, Ukraine had to focus on finding and eliminating the mobile ground-based systems that are most commonly used to fire these missiles. Because these launchers are always on the move, it's very difficult to pinpoint their exact locations. Russia regularly repositions them, moving a system to one location, firing a few missiles, then packing it all up and heading somewhere else before the enemy has a chance to react. Plus, with a range of up to 310 miles or 500 kilometers, Russia doesn't even need to position its Iskander launchers near Ukraine's borders. It can keep them relatively deep in its own territory, far beyond the reach of many Ukrainian missiles and other munitions. For some military forces, it would be an almost impossible task to find and destroy these systems. But not for Ukraine. Patiently, its teams watched and waited, knowing that eventually Russia would make a mistake. And when it did, Ukraine would be ready to pounce. In June 2025, that moment arrived. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported a successful strike on several Iskander missile launchers in the Bryansk region of Russia. Ukrainian surveillance teams managed to spot the systems not far from the city of Klintsy. It's believed that they were being prepared for a strike on a Ukrainian city, most likely the capital Kyiv, since they were positioned quite close to the country's border. Acting quickly and decisively, units of both the armed forces and the security service of Ukraine carried out a precise missile strike on the launcher batteries. 8 Russian servicemen were killed in the operation, with 5 more injured. But most importantly, one of the 3 launchers was reportedly destroyed and the other 2 severely damaged, which was a massive blow to the Kremlin's offensive capabilities. This also meant that whatever strike the Russians had been preparing was entirely nullified, and it's impossible to say how many lives were saved that day thanks to Ukraine's swift and efficient response. It's worth noting too that each Iskander launcher typically carries 2 missiles, each valued in excess of $3 million. So, when one of these systems is destroyed or even damaged, it's not just a logistical blow for the enemy to endure, but a financial one as well. And Russia was already reeling at that time after another high-profile attack had obliterated its Kinzhal launch platforms just a few days earlier. But before we take a closer look at that, there's more where this came from. So if you're getting value from the military show, don't forget to subscribe. While Iskander-Ms are fired from ground-based launchers, Kinzhals work quite differently. They fall into the category of air-launched ballistic missiles, meaning they have to be fired from aircraft, including the likes of MiG-31 interceptors and Tu-22M long-range strike bombers. Ukrainian intelligence operations discovered that a huge number of Tu-22Ms were stored at several airfields across Russia, with some of them several hundred or even thousands of miles from the border with Ukraine. If Ukraine could somehow damage, disable, or even destroy some of those bombers, it would dramatically limit the enemy's ability to launch Kinzhals for the foreseeable future. Such a complex operation would be incredibly difficult to pull off, demanding months, if not years, of planning and close attention to the tiniest of details. A single hitch could ruin even the most carefully prepared plan, and Ukraine knew it would most likely only get one opportunity to make this attack work. So, Ukraine's intelligence teams and commanders did what they've done throughout this war. They didn't rush or panic, they bided their time, developing a strategy that would give them the best chance of success. It required over a year of preparation, but on June 1, 2025, the wait paid off. Ukraine carried out the now iconic Operation Spiderweb attack. It hit dozens of drones aboard civilian-style trucks, which then took up strategic locations close to Russian airfields far and wide across the vast nation. When the time was right, the drone swarms were released, targeting 5 separate airfields all at the same time. There had never been an attack quite like this before, and even the finest militaries in the world would have struggled to piece together and execute a plan like this. Somehow, however, Ukraine did it, destroying anywhere from 7 to 11 of Russia's Tu-95MS and Tu-22M3 bombers in the process. Several other aircraft also suffered damages, with many beyond repair, and some estimates suggest that around a third of the Kremlin's bomber fleet was eliminated that day. It was arguably the biggest blow that Russia had suffered in the entire war so far. But Ukraine wasn't stopping there. No sooner had Operation Spiderweb concluded than Ukrainian agents were already on the hunt for their next targets, committed to eradicating Russia's missile strike capabilities once and for all. In March 2026, they struck again. This time, they weren't focused on Russia's missile stockpiles or launch platforms, but instead on a critical piece of infrastructure, the Kremny L factory in the Bryansk region, to be precise. On the face of it, this microelectronics plant may not appear all that important, but it was here that Russia produced some of the most important components in its extensive missile arsenal, the chips and microprocessors that power the likes of Iskander ballistic missiles, as well as Pantsir, Topol-M and Bulava missile systems, plus some of Russia's best air defense complexes like the S-300 and S-400. The plant, which first opened its doors in 1958, was also involved in the production of one of Russia's newest cruise missiles, the Izdelia-30. With a warhead weighing in at over 1,750 pounds or 800 kilograms and a range of up to 930 miles or 1,500 kilometers, this missile is no joke. It can be launched from the Su-34 aircraft, and Russia is believed to have in excess of 120 of those specific planes, which could allow it to launch massive aerial attacks on Ukrainian targets in the future. Ukraine has already witnessed the destructive powers of this missile. In early March 2026, it's believed that one or more of these missiles wiped out a residential building in the Kharkiv region, with 10 people killed in the blast and more than a dozen others injured. It's certainly possible that some of the core components found inside that missile, and countless others, came from the Kremny plant, the second largest microelectronics manufacturer in all of Russia. So, Ukraine took it out. On March 10, the country's armed forces carried out a precision missile strike using Storm Shadow missiles, which had been sent to Kyiv from France and the United Kingdom to deal as much damage to the facility as possible. 7 missiles were confirmed to have struck the factory, with its central building being completely destroyed and missile component production completely halted. This is so important because without those chips and other elements, Russia will not be able to make more missiles like the Iskander-M and Izdeliya-30 in the quantities it needs to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses. In addition, it's believed that at least some of the equipment that was used at the facility originally came from countries like the United States and Japan. Some of that gear was decades old, and with both the US and Japan unwilling to do business with Russia right now, the Kremlin faces an impossible task if it wants to replace that equipment and get the factory up and running once again. Other places that could help, like Taiwan, which is one of the world leaders in microelectronics industry, also have no interest in aiding Russia, leaving Moscow with a rising pile of problems and no obvious solutions. As a result, it could take years for Russia to rebuild this facility and restore its original production capacity. In the meantime, it may have to resort to more drastic and desperate measures, like smuggling in chips from overseas just to keep its missile program going. Even then, it will have a hard time making the likes of Iskander missiles in the quantities it could before. And that's good news for Ukraine, which should, as a result, find it even easier to plan its next moves, which could include additional attacks on other production plants, launch platforms, or ammunition stockpiles far and wide across Russia's regions. Kyiv's forces have proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that they can hit Russia anytime, anywhere. And while Russia's strike capabilities weaken, Ukraine's are only getting stronger. When the war began, this country was not at all known as a major military power. It didn't have a vast domestic defense industry or any sort of reputation for creating world-leading weapons and defensive systems. But as time has gone by, that has changed massively. Hundreds of domestic defense firms have been created across Ukraine, with forward-thinking teams of developers, designers, and engineers piecing together some of the most exciting military innovations of the 21st century. Firepoint is one of those companies. Founded early into the war, Firepoint first produced long and mid-range strike drones, which went on to become some of the most commonly used unmanned aerial vehicles in the Ukrainian military, involved in over 50% of the country's strike missions. Then, Firepoint went further, developing the Flamingo, a long-range cruise missile carrying a payload of 2,500 pounds or 1,150 kilograms at speeds of up to 560 miles per hour or 900 kilometers per hour. Capable of covering distances of around 1,850 miles or 3,000 kilometers, the Flamingo has quickly become one of the best weapons at Ukraine's disposal, using satellite guidance to hone in on its targets and low-altitude flight paths to evade detection and interception as it draws nearer to its destination. 2026 has seen several confirmed reports of Flamingo missile strikes on Russian military facilities, many miles from the front line. Targets include the Votkinsk machine building plant in Udmurtia, where ballistic missiles are assembled, the Kaputsin Yar missile test range in the Astrakhan region, a GRAU ammunition depot in the Volgograd region, and a Federal Security Service (FSB) installation in occupied Crimea. With the Flamingo proving useful, and other missiles like the Neptune and Long Neptune also bolstering Ukraine's arsenal, Kyiv's forces are slowly but surely evening the odds with Russia when it comes to both sides' respective missile capabilities. And it's not stopping there. Firepoint is already hard at work on a brand new medium-range ballistic missile, currently codenamed FP7, which could pave the way for even more devastating attacks on enemy targets in the months to come. And that's just one company. Across Ukraine, other defense contractors are also working tirelessly on new drones, defensive systems, missile platforms, and other military innovations to give their country the very best chance of not merely withstanding, but perhaps even winning this war. Meanwhile, the country's armed forces are continuously looking for new targets and planning their next moves. If Ukraine can continue to get stronger missiles while also weakening Russia's ability to launch the likes of Kinzhals and Iskanders, it will continue to shift the balance of power even more in their favor. And this entire story is yet another example of how Ukraine's smart, strategic approach to this war has consistently allowed the country to defy the odds and perform far beyond expectations.
For years, it's been something that Russia could use to devastate Ukraine. Vast swarms of drones and missiles have been used to strike Ukraine's cities and shatter its infrastructure. However, necessity is the mother of invention, and Ukraine has developed into the best in the world at countering the one thing that Russia relied on. Ukraine is swatting down everything that flies, combining mastery of a key air defense system with new technologies that are having a huge impact on Ukraine's interception rate. First, we take you to the night of April 15th. On that night, Russia launched yet another of its long-range attacks against Ukraine. It wasn't the largest aerial strike that Russia had unleashed. By the end of the attack, Ukraine worked out that Russia had launched a trio of Iskander-M ballistic missiles at its territory from the Rostov region, along with 234 strike drones, which included a swarm of 250 Shahid-type drones. Those drones flew from 7 different locations inside Russia and the occupied territories, which makes Russia's goal clear: overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses with drones so that the missiles could get through. It's a strategy that Russia has used to great effect before. However, on this night, Ukraine had the perfect counter. In less than an hour, Ukraine's air defenses intercepted all 3 of the Iskander-M missiles that Russia launched. On top of that, Ukraine took out 309 of the incoming Russian drones. It was also tracking 3 others that were still in Ukrainian airspace but appear to have lost their way en route to their targets. Assuming those 3 get taken down, the maths behind this defense tells an interesting story. For the missiles alone, Ukraine achieved a 100% interception rate. On the drone front, only 13 of Russia's unmanned aerial vehicles managed to get through to their intended targets, United 24 media reports. That leaves 311 that failed, which gives Ukraine an interception rate of 95.9%. Add the ballistic missiles and drones together, and that interception rate climbs to 96%, right in line with the 95% that Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov wants his country to achieve. This is a headline in its own right. Ukraine has set a massive target and has achieved it. That alone is an indicator that Ukraine has built world-class air defenses, which is a topic that we're going to be exploring in more depth later. However, there's an aspect of this story that has caught everybody off guard. Ukraine intercepted all 3 of Russia's ballistic missiles. That's newsworthy in terms of saving Ukrainian citizens from a whole lot of destructive Russian force, but that isn't the most important part of the story. How Ukraine is managing to carry out these types of interceptions is the true proof that it's become a master of an air defense system that wasn't even designed on its territory. Ukraine would likely have destroyed Russia's ballistic missiles with Patriot interceptors, and it's using those interceptors in a way that bucks the entire doctrine of the US and NATO. All was revealed by a unit commander of a Ukrainian formation that operates Patriot air defense systems, who recently spoke to Air Command West, which is part of Ukraine's Air Force. That unit commander revealed that Ukraine has found a way to make its Patriot missile stockpiles last longer, and it's done so by becoming the most efficient user of the Patriot system to date. How? It all comes down to the typical rules of engagement for using the Patriot to take out a target. The official NATO protocols call for the users of a Patriot system to fire between 2 and 4 interceptor missiles at whatever is coming their way. There's plenty of logic behind this doctrine. The more interceptors you fire, the greater chance of at least one of those missiles taking out the target. The challenge emerges when you have a limited number of interceptor missiles and a large number of targets that need to be shot out of the sky. Ukraine has found a solution to that challenge, and it's a solution that bucks all conventions. We try to use as few missiles as possible. Even if the rules of engagement call for the use of 2 to 4 missiles against certain difficult targets, we destroy them with 1, the unit commander claims in a video. What this tells us is that Ukraine's Patriot crews have managed to refine their targeting and engagement capabilities beyond anything that the US or NATO thought possible. The 2 to 4 doctrine was created in part because NATO knew that crews operating the Patriot wouldn't have extensive experience using the system outside of training. A much different reality has emerged in Ukraine. Russia's non-stop aerial assaults mean that Ukraine's Patriot crews are combat-tested to a degree that no other users of the American air defense system could hope to be. The old adage says that practice makes perfect. Ukraine has proven that, as constant practice has allowed it to figure out how to maximize its limited stockpiles of Patriot missiles. Think about what this means in terms of cost and scale. If Ukraine followed NATO doctrine on the night of April 15th, it would have needed to rattle off up to 12 Patriot interceptors to deal with the 3 Iskander-M ballistic missiles that Russia launched. Costs vary depending on the type of interceptor that Ukraine launched. RBC Ukraine says that a PAC-3 missile costs between $3 million and $4 million. The US Congress says that the cost of a Patriot interceptor falls into the higher end of that spectrum, which means that following the NATO doctrine for Patriot usage would have cost Ukraine up to $48 million to halt 1 Russian strike. But Ukraine is going missile for missile. Rather than $48 million, Ukraine would have spent a maximum of $12 million to take out the trio of Russian Iskander-M ballistic missiles on April 15th. According to Pravda, an Iskander-M ballistic missile costs around $3 million. Ukraine was still on the losing end in terms of the cost battle. However, its mastery of the Patriot air defense system means that it was only in the red by $3 million at the end of April 15th, rather than the $39 million gap Ukraine would have to deal with if it followed NATO doctrine. This is where the mechanics of scale come into play, not just for Ukraine. The US, NATO, and the Middle East nations that use Patriot missile interceptors will all be looking at what Ukraine has just achieved, and they'll be asking questions. Chief among them is how necessary it is to use 4 missiles for a single target. NATO says that's what's needed, but Ukraine is proving with its Patriots that you can do with 1 what NATO says needs between 2 and 4. If other nations can mirror Ukraine's success, they can drastically reduce the cost of using their Patriot interceptors, as well as take out more targets before their stockpiles are depleted. The US should be asking Ukraine how it does it. According to the European Consortium for Political Research, the US used over 800 Patriot missiles during the first 3 days of Operation Epic Fury. If the US had the sort of mastery over its own weapon that Ukraine has developed, it could have used between 200 and 400 instead. Even at the lower end of the NATO doctrine spectrum, which would see the US using 2 interceptors per target, that's a saving of $1.6 billion. These massive cost savings are one of the reasons why Ukraine becoming the best in the world at using the Patriot could be crucial for both itself and its allies. There is another which is more focused on Ukraine itself. But before we get to that, Defense Blog offers some interesting information that it has gleaned from the Facebook video in which Ukraine's use of 1 interceptor per ballistic missile was revealed. It says that the Patriot launch unit shown in the video has been configured so that it can carry 2 PAC-2 Patriot interceptors, along with 4 PAC-3s. Though both are usable by a Patriot system, these missiles work very differently. The PAC-2, as the name implies, is the older of the 2. It destroys its target via proximity detonation, which means that the PAC-2's warhead explodes as the missile approaches the incoming threat, with the resulting fragmentation leading to the destruction of the threat. PAC-3 missiles have a hit-to-kill approach, which is what it says on the tin. The interceptor collides directly with the incoming target before its warhead explodes. PAC-3 missiles require more accuracy, but they also produce more reliable results. PAC-2 interceptors sacrifice a touch of reliability for a greater chance to score a hit on an incoming threat, even if that hit doesn't take the threat out. However, Ukraine is operating both. The commander didn't specify which type of interceptor missiles Ukraine is using in its 1-for-1 strategy, which leads us to an interesting conclusion: it's able to use both. If that's the case, Ukraine has figured out how best to utilize the strengths of each type of interceptor in ways that nobody else has, which requires an exceptional level of target tracking and fire control timing. And remember, this is all being done against ballistic missiles that can travel at several times the speed of sound. The level of discipline and operational refinement needed to pull off something like this is insane. At this point, there's no arguing against the fact that Ukraine is the best in the world at using the Patriot air defense system. But the other wrinkle to this story, and the second reason why this is so important for Ukraine, is that this is a skill born as much out of necessity as it is the result of growing expertise. Before we explain what that means, this is a quick reminder that you're watching The Military Show. If you want to see more of this kind of insight, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. So Ukraine is cutting down on costs and increasing its kill counts through its mastery of the Patriot interceptor. The real reason why this matters, for Ukraine perhaps more than any other nation, is that Ukraine doesn't have enough Patriot missiles to follow the NATO doctrine. It has received as many as its allies can provide, with the US, Germany, and the Netherlands all having provided interceptors from their stockpiles. However, the production of Patriot missiles is finite. Plus, with the US having tied itself up in a war with Iran that has seen it use huge numbers of Patriot missiles, stockpiles that might have gone to Ukraine are instead being used to take out Iranian Shahid drones. By reducing missile expenditure by a factor of up to 4, Ukraine is conserving ammunition that is in very, very short supply. Ukraine knows that it isn't likely to get a reliable source of Patriot interceptors for a while. The US, which was Ukraine's main source, needs as many of its missiles as it can for its campaign in Iran. Worse yet for Ukraine, US Vice President J.D. Vance went on record in mid-April to proclaim that ending military aid to Ukraine was one of the proudest achievements of his time in the Trump administration. If that's the case, Ukraine seemingly can't rely on the US to restart military aid or to provide more Patriot missiles as and when they're needed. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky pulls no punches when he talks about Ukraine's Patriot missile shortages. The situation is in such a deficit, it could not be any worse, Zelensky declared in the wake of Vance's comments. If Ukraine's Patriot interceptor situation is as dire as Zelensky says, then its mastery of the system is a necessity. Ukraine simply can't afford to burn through more Patriot missiles than it needs to counter Russia's ballistic missile threat. Stockpile woes aside, what Ukraine's revolutionary use of the Patriot shows us is that the country's air defense strategy has evolved to the point where it's now among the best in the world. The Centre for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, highlights that in an April 13th piece where it labels Ukraine's air defenses as world-class, while noting that those air defenses are still improving. And though Ukraine's doctrine-bucking use of the Patriot is the example that we've focused on for most of the video, there is something else that Ukraine has added to its air defense game that makes it the envy of the rest of the world: interceptor drones. Though dealing with ballistic missiles still amounts to firing expensive missiles at expensive threats, the real challenge for Ukraine lies in Russia's use of Shahid-type attack drones, both for strikes and to confuse air defense systems that should be focusing on missiles. As we saw on April 15th, Russia launches hundreds of Shahid drones alongside its missiles during its airstrikes. Even Ukraine's hyper-efficiency with its Patriot systems can't account for that. Billions of dollars would be blown up in the skies if Ukraine started using Patriot missiles to counter Shahids, and the stockpile issues that are critical for Ukraine right now would be a non-factor. Ukraine wouldn't even have stockpiles to speak of. Interceptor drones have changed the game for Ukraine's air defense, and they would have been a huge factor in Ukraine achieving the 96% interception rate we spoke about earlier during Russia's April 15th attack. The numbers say it all. On April 8th, Fedorov noted that Ukraine's interceptor drones destroyed 33,000 of Russia's strike drones in March. That number covers unmanned aerial vehicles of all types, not just the long-range Shahid drones that Russia launches. 33,000 is also twice as many drones as Ukraine's interceptors destroyed during the previous month, and this drone destruction is likely why Ukraine's overall drone interception rate rose to 89.9% in March. February saw that rate hit 85.6%, which was already a substantial improvement over the 80.2% rate recorded back in December. This pattern is also paired with the fact that Russia has been launching more drones at Ukraine, CEPA points out. March alone saw Russia fire 28% more drones at Ukraine, and Ukraine still intercepted more of them. Ukraine's mastery of air defense was cast into an even stronger spotlight by its Ministry of Defense. The 89.9% interception rate covers both missiles and drones. If we only focus on Shahid-type drones, then Russia fired 6,463 at Ukraine in March, of which 5,835 were intercepted. That amounts to an interception rate of 90.25%, which is incredible given the sheer volume of drones that Russia is launching. But here's where Ukraine's interceptor drones really shine. They cost far less than Russia's Shahid-type drones. According to Euronews, a single interceptor drone costs Ukraine between €1,000 and €4,000, or around $1,170 to $4,700 to make. A Russian Shahid costs between €25,000 and €40,000, or $29,400 and $47,000 to build. Both are low-cost weapons. Shahids costing so little is the main reason why using multi-million-dollar missiles to counter them, as the US has been doing in Iran, leads to a country burning through billions of dollars in a matter of days. But with its interceptor drones, Ukraine has developed a counter to the Shahids that costs as little as a 20th of what Russia is spending on building its long-range drones. What we're seeing from Ukraine right now is that it's tackling the core challenge of modern air defense. That challenge isn't taking out big missiles with expensive interceptors, though that is still a part of the overall problem. The far greater challenge is finding the balance between cost and volume. Russia has already done that on the strike end. A handful of missiles combined with hundreds of drones allows Russia to hit hard without spending as much as it would if it relied on missiles alone. The irony here is that Ukraine has taken this approach and applied it to defense. Ukraine is also using fewer missiles and more drones. Only its interceptor drones are so cheap that they eliminate any benefit that Russia experienced from using its Shahids in the first place. Shahid drones were supposed to make airstrikes cheaper for Russia and more expensive for Ukraine. Now the tables have turned, and it's Russia that is losing more money than Ukraine every time it attacks from the skies. None of this happened overnight. Ukraine has become a master of air defenses because Russia's attacks over the last few years have forced it to figure out ways to counter the sheer volume. Interceptor drones, Patriot missiles, and much more are now part of a layered air defense model that the former chairman of Ukraine's Artificial Intelligence Committee, Vitaly Goncharuk, says was developed over 18 months that also saw Ukraine boost its propeller-driven drone output significantly. Ukraine has figured out the trick to air defense, which is that there is no single, correct system to use against the Russian threat. There are several tools, each of which can be used against a specific type of weapon that Russia unleashes. There are still challenges ahead. Russia is moving toward using Shahid-type drones equipped with jet engines, which are supposed to make them faster and thus more difficult to intercept. But Ukraine is even rising to that challenge. On April 14th, Militani reported that Ukraine's interceptor drones are already taking out Russia's newer jet-powered drones. Ukraine is also working on laser-based air defense systems which can tear through Russia's faster drones at almost zero cost. These types of weapons are still in their prototype phases, but the fact that they're being developed at all shows us that Ukraine's mastery of air defense hasn't only occurred because it's the best in the world at using existing systems. Ukraine is developing brand new weapons to answer every air defense question that Russia tries to raise. With all of this in mind, is it any wonder that Ukraine is now being courted by some pretty major players who want to get their hands on its air defense secrets? Ukraine's interceptor drones, combined with its 4 years of experience in dealing with Russian Shahed-type drones, are the reason why Gulf states are signing defense deals with Ukraine. These deals, which Ukraine has signed with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, each last for a decade and have already led to Ukraine sending over 200 anti-drone experts to the Middle East in March. But the really important thing about these deals is what Ukraine gets in return. Weapons, fuel, and cash are all coming Ukraine's way, as is a new level of influence in the Middle East that Ukraine has never had before. That's what being the best in the world gets you. As Ukraine continues to improve its layered air defense strategy, as it makes its use of Western systems more efficient than anybody thought they could be, it's developing expertise that it can leverage for its military's gain. Ukraine's air defenses already protect it directly, but with that leverage comes protection that arrives in the form of fuel and cash, which are countering Russia's strategy of wearing Ukraine down. There's a lot more to say about the Gulf deals, by the way. Ukraine's air defense expertise is so extensive that it may be the key to reopening the Strait of Hormuz if Operation Epic Fury reignites. When Ukraine received M1 Abrams tanks from the US and Australia, nobody could have seen what would come next. There have been upgrades aplenty, and Ukraine has made the M1 unstoppable. Turtle tanks? More like an unrelenting force through upgrades that have turned the M1 into a beast that Russia can't handle. Ukraine's upgraded tanks are out of this world, and even the US will be sniffing around for the upgrades which counter drones in a way never seen before. Ukraine's transformation of the M1 Abrams into a turtle tank that can actually operate as both a tank and a defensive force against drones is nothing short of remarkable. And you'll be finding out just how useful these tanks have been in the southern counter-offensive soon. But first, the basics. According to a March 31st Euromaidan press report by former Forbes military contributor David Axe, Ukraine has been workshopping its supply of M1 Abrams by adding layers of anti-drone protection to its baseline armor. Ukraine's 1st Assault Regiment is leading the charge for this new generation of anti-drone tanks, as we've seen from images that have emerged of it turning the tank into a lethal combination of furious firepower and drone-shattering defenses. The regiment has even taken to Telegram to share photographs of the M1 transformation that it's completed. Tanks, APCs, and MRAPs are being covered with custom protection adapted to changes in the battlefield. Strong armor means a surviving crew and troops, and therefore a completed mission. Those who adapt, survive, and move forward, the 1st Assault Regiment declares in a statement alongside the shared pictures. And at a first glance, those pictures seem to show a Frankenstein of a tank that looks very different from what you would expect an M1 Abrams to look like. There are what appear to be metal cages on either side of the tank's gun. The images show workers welding more steel and cages to their tank. This looks like a mishmash of solutions, a makeshift method for making the M1 Abrams difficult for drones to take down. But the reality is that what we see in the pictures is the result of months of design evolution that has been focused on achieving one key thing: creating an anti-drone turtle tank that can actually fire its main weapon. The major drawback of every tank that uses drone cages that we've seen so far in the war is that the cages stop the tank from using its main guns for protection. It's often the sacrifice of firepower for enhanced defenses, and it essentially means that the tank becomes useless for one of the main reasons why it exists in the first place. Not anymore. Ukraine's M1 Abrams transformation has delivered a turtle tank that can fire, and this has been a multi-unit effort. The 47th Mechanized Brigade was among the first to strengthen the defenses of their M1 Abrams tanks. Axe reports that this brigade started adding new layers of explosive reactive armor to their stock of Abrams, along with rubber skirts designed to stiffen the composite armor built into the 30 or so tanks that they had in their arsenal. That was a good start. More would come. The 425th Assault Regiment is another that has a small stockpile of Abrams tanks, and it's been busy developing defenses of its own. Their dozen M1s now sport large metal frames that can support drone-detonating metal spines in the thousands. The concept is remarkably simple. Russia's FPV kamikaze drones hit the spines and the frames that contain them before they hit the tank. So the drone explodes harmlessly and the tank pushes on. Then comes what the 1st Assault Regiment has done. Those metal cages we mentioned earlier, the ones on either side of the Abrams main gun, those cages are part of a new metal frame that surrounds the M1 turret, which allow that turret to rotate left and right so that tank operators can actually aim their most important weapon. This is a revolution in anti-drone armor for tanks. It means that operators are no longer limited to steering their tanks in the precise direction of a target if they want to rattle off a shot. This transformation means that the M1 Abrams in Ukraine's possession can actually work like tanks are supposed to work, with the added benefit of being loaded with enough anti-drone armor to make them unstoppable as they move forward through Russia's FPV drone kill zones. But here's where a sweet dose of irony comes into play. For so long the innovator in the war, Ukraine has turned into a copycat for this particular invention. Russia has been looking for ways to turn its turtle tanks into actual working tanks again, and the blueprints of a design that emerged from Russia have served as the foundation for everything that Ukraine has created with its transformed M1 Abrams tanks. The Russian blueprints emerged toward the end of January, and they showed that Russia has started installing similar anti-drone cages into the turrets of their tanks, allowing turrets to rotate and fire. It took nearly 4 years for Russia to come up with this idea after it had spent the entire Ukraine war losing thousands of tanks to Ukraine's drones. But as soon as the blueprint emerged, Ukraine saw it, copied it, and made it better. Those blueprints first appeared on social media, which suggests that there is a leak somewhere at the Siberian Omsk Transmash tank plant that reportedly created the blueprints and intended to use them in the manufacturing of the new T-80 tanks for Russia. These blueprints suggest that Russia is making a concerted effort to build anti-drone tanks en masse, but it never expected Ukraine to pick up on one of the few examples of Russian innovation in Putin's invasion and turn it into a weapon that can be used against Putin's forces. Russia may have come up with the idea, but it's Ukraine that is currently proving how well it works in its southern territories. As for the US, it may well be happy to see what Ukraine is doing to its M1 Abrams tanks. Ukraine, in turn, will be happy about that. Toward the end of 2025, Australia completed the delivery of 49 M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, in a move that 1945 says angered the US. The outlet says that the US had tried to steer Australia away from providing the tanks to Ukraine, amidst a pause to military aid from the US implemented by the Trump administration in early 2026. Whether that's true or speculation on 1945's part remains to be seen, but now the US will be more than happy to see that Ukraine is modifying its tanks to counter drones. After all, that may be a technology that the US will need sooner rather than later, especially if talk of a potential ground invasion of Iran turns into action. Iran is the home of Shahid drones, and there are already reports that it's working alongside Russia to counter Operation Epic Fury. If a US ground invasion happens and becomes large enough to involve tanks and armored vehicles, Iran will likely start deploying the same kinds of FPV drones that Ukraine is countering with its Abrams modifications. If that's the case, the US now has the blueprint on how to counter that approach from a nation that is doing everything that it can to reinforce its alliance with the US. Some will deride what Ukraine has come up with as the latest version of a Frankenstein tank that Russia has been mocked for creating. But they are so much more than that. Russia's real problem is that Ukraine has taken the mock cope cages of the past and turned them into legitimate assets that are making the M1 Abrams a powerful force on the battlefield. And this isn't speculation. There is footage of Ukraine's transformed tanks that prove these weapons will be a huge asset in the southern counteroffensive. That alone changes everything. And by the way, there's a lot more where this comes from. If you're getting value from the military show, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now, the footage. What does it show? To answer that question, we head to Pryluki, which is, or was, home to an enemy stronghold in the Zaporizhia region. Since the beginning of February, which is right around the time that Ukraine's southern counteroffensive started, that stronghold was being assaulted by the 1st Assault Regiment. Artillery was deployed, and it smashed Russian defenses to pieces. As always, Ukraine's drones were in the mix, taking out Russian troop deployments and conducting reconnaissance. But the star of the show was a modified M1 Abrams tank that finished off the offensive with a trio of strikes that simplified the work of assault troops on the ground, just as a tank is supposed to do. The 25 seconds of footage shared by the Ukrainian Liberation open source Intelligence X account shows Ukraine's new tank in action. From the beginning of the video, we see a trio of Russian positions highlighted, and the tank rolling down the road to confront them. Then the first shot. One position goes as the Abrams scores a direct hit. The tank then moves forward and confronts the second Russian position. We see the same result. Aim, fire, destruction. Another position goes down. Finally, we see the perfect example of what Ukraine's latest innovation has achieved for its tanks. Without moving forward, the tank rotates its barrel to the right and fires on the last Russian position. The tank didn't need to move forward or turn around, it did what it was supposed to do, rotate its barrel and fire. Now, Ukraine has a tank that works as a tank should, only it's much more effective. Defense matches offense, and Russia has no answer for it. The location where Ukraine utilized its M1 Abrams is important. Zaporizhzhia is part of the southern region into which Ukraine has been pushing since the end of January as it reclaims swathes of territory. That alone is a humiliation for Russia that we'll be returning to very soon. But ahead of this humiliation is the embarrassment that Putin and his cronies will feel about the fact that Ukraine now seems to be the frontrunner when it comes to using tanks on the battlefield. That was never supposed to be the case. Russia is meant to be the king of tanks. The country's massive stockpile was as much part of its military identity as they were a threat to Ukraine when Putin launched his invasion. However, heavy losses over 4 years of warfare have led to Russian tanks being fielded far less than Putin would like. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, Russia has lost 11,830 of its tanks between the beginning of the invasion and April 2nd. That figure veers uncomfortably close to 3,000 tanks per year that Russia is losing, which has been a huge body blow for a nation that believed that it could roll into Ukraine with its armor and take over everything. Now, Russia is a nation with tank paralysis. As Axe notes, Russia has been forced to park its tanks, only deploying them in small numbers, and always in fear of the repeated hits that Ukraine can deliver with its FPV drones. Much of 2025 saw Russian forces having to ditch their slow-moving tanks in favor of smaller and faster armored vehicles, or in many cases, motorcycles and civilian vehicles that those troops thought would stand more of a chance of evading the drones. When that strategy didn't work, Russia's commanders didn't return to the tanks. They started sending soldiers into Ukrainian territory on foot, often as part of small infiltration units that were tasked with setting up defenses and waiting for backup that often doesn't come. Russia's primary and favored strategy of massive mechanized assaults had to be abandoned. Russian tank losses have dropped sharply in Ukraine as a result of this forced change in approach. For instance, Defense Express reports that Russia suffered just 14 confirmed tank losses in January, and only 5 in February. Compare that to March 2022's figures of 278 confirmed tank losses, and it becomes very clear that Russia has had to stop using the mechanized assaults that Putin favors because it lost so many of its tanks that it can't pull those assaults off anymore. That's humiliating enough in its own right, but salt really gets ground into the Russian wound when it sees Ukraine's M1 Abrams tank doing what we saw in Zaporizhzhia. As Russia has been forced to park its tanks, Ukraine's tank operators are getting bolder. They're not launching full-blown mechanized assaults. Ukraine doesn't have enough M1s for that, and Russia's drones still pose too much danger. With its newly armored tanks, Ukraine can launch flash counterattacks against Russian positions that see its tanks go in, destroy quickly, and get out again, all while they're protected by a new form of anti-drone armor that makes them capable of rotating their turrets once again. Compare that to Russia's attempts to create something similar. Though Ukraine's design has been inspired by an alleged Russian blueprint, the reality for many of Russia's tank operators is that they haven't seen anything like what Ukraine has just introduced to the battlefield. Russia's turtle tanks are loaded with defenses, sure, but they're packed so full that turrets can't rotate and the tanks themselves can barely move. One example comes from March 29th, when Euromaidan Press published a picture of what it dubbed a giga-turtle tank that was covered in every type of defense that Russia could think of. Spines, chains, and mine rollers were all over the tank to the point where its turret wasn't even visible. That armor has weight. The giga-turtle can only reach speeds of 10 kilometers or 6.2 miles per hour. Russia has traded maneuverability and utility for defense, while Ukraine is finding the balance between all three factors. The Russian giga-turtle is a massive target that seems designed to force Ukraine to expend more drones and ammunition in taking it out and nothing else. But Ukraine's M1 Abrams modifications allow it to deliver firepower combined with effective defenses against Russia's drones. That brings us back to Zaporizhzhia and Ukraine's southern counteroffensive. What Ukraine has managed to build here is ideal for supporting a counteroffensive that has been happening since SpaceX shut down Russia's access to the illicit Starlink terminals that it had been using to coordinate drone and troop movements across the front lines. The chaos in the Russian ranks that ensued created opportunities for Ukraine to push back against Russian occupiers, and, as we saw in Zaporizhzhia, to use its tanks against isolated pockets of defenses that are cut off from their commanders behind the front lines. The drone gap widened in the grey zones that are beyond the front lines, as Russia couldn't communicate with soldiers that it had infiltrated into those regions. Ukraine is taking advantage of this by using its modified tanks to smash Russia's defenses, which sets the stage for drones and ground forces to mop up the remains and reclaim territory for Ukraine. It's an approach that has been working for over 2 months. By March 26, the New Voice of Ukraine was reporting that Ukraine had liberated 9 settlements and 440 square kilometers, or just under 170 miles of territory in the Oleksandrivka sector. Russian losses have been extensive during this operation, which has countered Russia's attempts to create a buffer zone in Ukraine's south. Tanks like the M1 Abrams have been leading the charge after reinforcing units such as the 425th Assault Regiment that we mentioned earlier charged south to deliver death to Russia's occupying forces. This is the sort of thing that Russia always tried to do with its mechanized assaults against Ukraine's defenses. Just as it improved upon Russia's blueprints to build its new M1 tank defenses, Ukraine has adapted Russia's strategy to allow for flash assaults using tanks that pave the way for the liberation of territory. Now it has tanks that can navigate through the drone-infested kill zones that Russia has attempted to create. That's even better for the southern counteroffensive. Though Russia's Starlink access has been switched off, it still has hordes of FPV drones of its own. It planned to build 2 million of them in 2025 alone. Those drones are as much of a danger to Ukraine's tanks as Ukraine's drones are to Russia's armor. But now Ukraine has anti-drone tanks that can counter this threat and still present the kind of attacking force that we saw in Zaporizhzhia. All of this is in service of what Ukraine plans to achieve in 2026: exhaust Russia's forces, deny them breakthroughs, and build reserves that Ukraine can use for more counteroffensives and to defend itself against Russia. Those are the 3 goals that the Ukrainian Army's Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrskyi laid out toward the end of March. Ukraine wants to make Putin's forces dance to the Ukrainian tune. It's working. The 13-pronged spring offensive that Russia has launched is already being blocked across practically every axis. The southern counteroffensive, in which Ukraine unleashed its modified tanks, has played a huge role. That's especially the case in Ukraine's east, where Russia is pushing to try to take the Donbass. Putin's goal with the buffer zone we mentioned was to prevent Ukraine from sending reinforcements into the east via the south. Big holes have been blown through that buffer zone, and Russia is now being forced to commit more resources to the south, which in turn snatches resources away from its main effort in Ukraine's east. This was all carefully planned by Ukraine. When Starlink was shut down for Russia's forces, Ukraine executed its plans perfectly. Modified M1 Abrams tanks were part of the Ukrainian counteroffensive that saw it retake more territory from Russia than it has at any other point since the summer of 2023. Now the Abrams are ready for more. Equipped with new anti-drone armor and capable of doing what they were always designed to do, those tanks are going to continue taking part in Ukraine's flash assaults against Russia's defensive positions. Ukraine has something that is out of this world on its hands. Russia's troops have already felt the force of what it can deliver, but the odds are high that Ukraine is just getting started, and its tanks are going to become a true terror for Putin's patsies as more of them are equipped with the defenses that the 1st Assault Regiment has revealed. Despite all of the setbacks, Russia is still plowing ahead with its spring counteroffensive. That is a mistake. In return for their efforts, Russia's soldiers have suffered their deadliest day of the year so far, as thousands of them died in just 24 hours. Worse is coming. And you can find out more about that dreadful day for Russia if you check out our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to the Military Show so you don't miss any of our coverage of the Ukraine war. And thank you as always for watching.